Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sean Mack. I'm Director of Public Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Delighted to see you all here for a review of the COP21 meetings that happened late last year in Paris. Tonight we'll look at what happened and then also a preview of what's to come. Before we get started, today's conversation is on the record, so please feel free to tweet, Instagram, Facebook your thoughts, your favorite quotes from tonight, but please do silence your phones. We're also live streaming the event tonight, so now is the time to text your friends and tell them to stop watching the Iowa caucus results and tune into this conversation. I think we'll have some very long-ranging points raised tonight that will be at least as useful. Tonight's program came together in partnership with the University of Chicago's Energy Policy Institute, or EPIC for short. EPIC are a leader in a variety of topics related to energy and the environment, and they're working to translate the latest research into real-world impacts. They're also heavily focused on training future energy leaders to solve the challenges of tomorrow, and on that note, we're delighted to see a lot of those young leaders in audience tonight. I encourage you to follow EPIC on Twitter or delve into the wealth of the resources on their site at epic.uchicago.edu. Turning back to tonight, to introduce our panel, we're delighted to have with us someone who has been prompting public dialogue on these issues for many years. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Wendy Abrams, the founder of the global art exhibit Cool Globes.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited about this topic. As most of you know, 2015 has been a big year for climate change. It was, again, broke the record for the hottest year in recorded history, breaking 2014's record the year before. That's the bad news. But the good news is, as most of you know, there was a conference in Paris, COP21, where the world leaders came together and actually signed a treaty to address climate change. The treaty that was agreed upon in Paris was to limit emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases with the overreaching goal of limiting it to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. So although it wasn't perfect, there's a lot of good things about the agreement. There's still a lot of challenges about how are we going to implement it that remain a question that hopefully we can talk about tonight. Which steps were outlined in the agreement to make implementation a reality? Will the momentum of COP21 hold? How do we motivate companies and the private sector to invest in clean energy, especially in a time when the price of oil is so cheap? So there's a lot of issues that our panel is going to discuss tonight, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. Before we turn to these issues, I want to just introduce our panelists and the moderator. Their full bios are on your chair. Our first speaker is Paul Badr, who served as the White House National Security Counsel and a Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change. Ted Brandt is the co-founder and CEO of Marathon Capital, where he advised companies such as American Wind Capital and Rockland Capital on the sale and financing of alternative energy firms and assets. Michael Greenstone is the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics and Director of the Energy Policy Institute at University of Chicago. Derek Walker is the Associate Vice President for Global Climate at the Environmental Defense Fund. And we are pleased to have Ed Crooks as this evening's moderator. He is the U.S. Industry and Energy Editor at the Financial Times. So without further ado, please help me welcome our panel.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Wendy. Thank you very much to you and to EPIC for inviting me to this great city in this fantastic room. It is a wonderful place to be talking, isn't it? Great pleasure to be here. Also great pleasure to be discussing this extremely important topic. As you said, there was tremendous excitement and euphoria in Paris about the agreement at the end of COP21, but I think everyone would say that was really only the start of the effort to really tackle climate change in a serious way, and it's the steps that come after that that are really the important thing. So I think it's a great subject to be discussing, and a fantastic panel we have here to discuss it. So perhaps, Paul Bodden, if I can come to you first. So you were there. Perhaps you can explain to us a bit, just to kind of set the scene about Paris. What was agreed in Paris, and why is it important?
Sure, and let me start also by thanking EPIC and the Chicago Council for the invitation to be here tonight. The welcome opportunity to leave Washington and discuss this important milestone with you folks. As you say, Paris was a very important milestone. It was the 21st time that the parties to this climate convention under the UN had met. So this agreement was achieved on the 21st attempt. So this is an issue that we've been grappling with for a generation, and it's been extremely difficult to get countries to the point that we've gotten to last December. Let me just describe what it is, and then later in the evening maybe we can talk about how we got there and some of the interesting twists and turns. So the right way to think about the Paris Agreement is that it enables the countries of the world to ratchet down their emissions, their carbon emissions, over the course of this century, so that by the second half of the century, the global economy has achieved a climate neutral state, meaning that the amount that we emit is roughly equal to the amount that the planet is absorbing back. And with the goal of holding the overall increase in greenhouse gas in temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius. That's the objective, to get from here to there over the coming decades. And Paris is a kind of, maybe best understood as a kind of machine that countries have constructed to help them get there. So the purpose of the machine we've discussed, the operators of the machine are countries, and the fuel that goes into the machine are national climate targets. Now, 188 countries put forward targets before Paris, actually, to describe where their emissions would be in the 2025-2030 timeframe, which seems like a long time from now, but actually isn't so long when you consider the long life of power plants and cement plants and steel plants and other assets that generate emissions. So that's the first turn of the crank of this machine. These 188 targets, where are we going to be in 2030? And the answer is we will have made a lot of progress compared to the business as usual trajectory if we hit those targets. But it's not going to be enough. The world will still be on a trajectory to surpass 2 degrees. So we need to tighten up. And this machine will turn over in 5-year increments. Every 5 years, countries have to come forward with targets for 5 years later, and those targets always have to be more ambitious than the last round, and the agreement actually says they need to reflect the highest possible ambition that that country can commit to do. Now, each country is different. The UN is not telling the United States what to do, just as it's not telling China or Chad or Uganda or any country what to do. That's not how the structure works, and we can get into how we got to that sort of bottom-up approach later. But the basic idea is that 5-year increments, countries come forward with targets, and a lot of what the agreement talks about is how do we make sure that we know what other countries are doing. There are legally binding transparency and accountability provisions to maximize our understanding and make sure that we all want to get there, right? But we want to get there making sure that our economic competitors are also making an effort. And we need to know that they're making that effort, and we can't just put their targets in a black box and say, well, I hope they're doing something. So a lot of the agreement is about making sure that we understand what other countries are doing.
Because to leap back to a word used right at the beginning of that explanation, you said Paris, it's a sort of a mechanism that enables countries to cut their emissions. In other words, it doesn't force anyone to do anything, right? There's no compulsion there.
That's right.
Is that a right way to think about it?
That's right. And I think that's one of the interesting lessons we've learned about dealing with climate change at the international level, is that it's hard to force countries to reduce their emissions. So you have to first of all agree that it's desirable and that we all want to do it and that we see the benefits of transitioning to a clean energy economy. And then we need to create a coordination mechanism, which is what this is, to help countries move in a synchronized way toward that future.
Thank you. Michael, perhaps if I can bring you in here as an economist, how do you view this kind of problem? Is that, does that sound like a sensible way to be going about things?
I think it's a great way to begin. I think Paul's correct to underscore that it is probably the first step in a very important step, but the first step of many that are necessary. But I think maybe it's useful just, since probably not everyone in the room thinks quite as much about CO2 as probably the people on this panel, just to step back and ask, well, what is it that we're trying to do here, and what's the framework? And so I'll just start by saying, you know, there's a lot of controversy about climate change, but at least from a pure kind of textbook, academic, economic standpoint, it is an incredibly boring problem. It is not one that requires much deep thought. And the reason is quite simple, is that we use fossil fuels. That's the coal that powers power plants. It's the natural gas that warms your house. It's the petroleum that's in your car that helped many people get here tonight. We use those fossil fuels to change the way we live and make our life better. Unfortunately, in the process of using those fossil fuels, CO2 emissions come out. Those CO2 emissions go in the atmosphere. They change temperatures. And then those change in temperatures lead to all kinds of changes in our economy. Some in a few places in the world will probably be beneficial, but by and large, as far as research has been able to show, most of those changes will be negative. And so it's a really simple problem that by using these fossil fuels, we cause this set of damages that happen. And the simple economic solution to that is people should pay for those damages. It's kind of a very polluter pays or fairness principle. It's certainly a principle we try to use at our house with our children, that there should be kind of an even playing field. And that even playing field in this case would be for there to be a price or a tax on CO2 emissions. And I don't think there's an economist out there who disagrees with that.
So if only economists around the world, this wouldn't be a problem, right?
You know, I have that thought about 10 times a day.
Wait, right.
On a variety of topics.
And so,
what's the real challenge here?
the real world
the
we
real
do live in.
challenge is that the fossil fuels, part of why we use them so much is that they're very inexpensive. And they're cheaper than renewables and other low carbon energy sources if you do not account for this set of damages. And so if you were to level the playing field and when you were to purchase gas, you were to pay for the damages you're going to do, then that would alter the playing field and allow solar and wind and nuclear and things like that to play a bigger role in the energy system and bring down emissions, just as Paul was outlining.
And so what about, as I say, in the kind of the real world, unfortunately, that we do live in where economists not in charge?
Yeah, so the real world is terrible.
How do you get closer to that kind of ideal position?
Yeah, so I think the real world will involve piercing several, I think, domestic political problems. The problem is that the benefits are widely dispersed across the whole population, but the costs will be focused on particular regions. Not so good for West Virginia, not so good for mining coal and Wyoming. Particular industries will be affected disproportionately. And also these costs, energy costs are a higher fraction of low-income people's income, and they'll pay a little bit more. And so all of that leads to really complicated domestic politics. And I think we're actually making great progress in the U.S. on some of those. But even if all that can be solved, then there's also the international thing, which is that most of, basically all energy growth in the coming decades is projected to come from today's developing countries. And so what that means is the world really needs today's developing countries, and they're developing because they're poor, to buy more expensive energy. And that can be a hard ask. And there's one statistic that really makes this very salient, at least for me, is that the differences in energy consumption. So the state of Bihar in India has 100 million people. Per capita electricity consumption there is 140 kilowatt hours per year per person. In the US, it's about 14,000. And so you have to, at some level, Bihar, who has to increase their energy consumption, the world is effectively asking Bihar to use more expensive energy to do that. And that complicates it.
Derek, perhaps from the environmentalist point of view, you could tell us a bit about it. How did you view Paris?
Well, Paris was a diplomatic and political breakthrough for sure. I think right at the beginning, it got off on a great track. We had first day with over 100 heads of state, major announcements on new commitments to research and development of clean energy technologies, which certainly isn't the whole story, but will go a long way towards levelizing the costs between clean and dirty energy, especially in the developing world. And I'll say, this is a big change even from 5 years ago. You had those 188 countries that Paul mentioned that put commitments on the table, developed and developing countries. It used to be that in the US, a big reason for inaction or a big excuse for inaction was that developing countries weren't bringing anything to the table. And a big accomplishment that occurred even before we got to Paris was that there was this new paradigm of developed and developing countries working together. So that's one thing. Another huge moment from an environmental perspective was that we got incredibly strong language to enable countries to work together on market-based policies. These are policies like carbon taxes or cap-and-trade programs, many of which are already in place around the world, where there is a new level of interest and commitment and some additional rules of the road that the countries in the UN have now laid down. Markets are a great way to transition economies into lower carbon alternatives. And if you look at some examples from North America, California is working with Quebec in Canada and increasingly talking about working with other provinces in Canada and states in Mexico to come together and create joint programs to address climate change. Those larger, more ambitious efforts are in many ways a next step that can come out of Paris, because now we have some enabling commitments that have been made. So I think Paris in many ways was a watershed moment, long way to go, but in many ways much more ambitious than even the more ambitious among us would have foretold at the beginning.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on that point about developing countries' commitments, because, as you say, you'll hear argument is very often made, oh, well, there's no point in the United States doing anything because China isn't doing anything, India isn't doing anything. To which you say, well, actually, they are doing things. They've made these commitments coming into Paris. They are going to curb their emissions. Arguably, these are pretty weak commitments that they've actually made, right? They're still talking about growth in emissions. They just talk about cutting the emissions intensity of their economies. In other words, fewer emissions for every dollar of GDP that they have. Are these really kind of serious promises? Are these kind of things that the United States and other countries should kind of take seriously and to act on, or are they actually pretty flimsy?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the previous regime, there was a resistance by the developing world to even take on a target, how arguable it was or not. So we're in a new world where countries like China and India are in many ways leading the way. I mean, President Xi and President Obama, the diplomacy between those leaders in the last 2 years was an important stage setter for what happened in Paris. And so the proof will always be years down the road as we measure success. But thankfully, with Paris, we also have new tools to measure that success that we didn't have before.
So, sorry, Michael, you wanted to come in and then Paul?
Yeah, I just add on. I think what was really, I think perhaps when the history gets written, maybe an incredible step forward was the slaying of the, for climate nerds, the common but differentiated language, which was that basically put developing countries on a separate path with very few responsibilities. And the agreement with China, I guess now maybe 15 or 16 months ago, I think was an enormous step forward in breaking that. But to your question, I think what remains important is why will China and India and other countries like that see it as in their interest to reduce CO2 emissions? And my take on that is there's a lot of immediate concerns in those countries, and it's going to be hard for them to focus single-mindedly as in other countries on reducing CO2 emissions. But what is really, I think, a favorable path forward is the increasing recognition that the use, this very same fossil fuels that cause climate change are also causing horrendous levels of air pollution in China and in India. And that's impairing people's lives. Some of my own research suggests people are living several years less in India and China due to that air pollution. And attacking that problem can produce carbon dioxide benefits, and I think could be kind of an immediate, let's call it, bridge to the day where taking on CO2 as a first order of concern is in their interest.
And to get you to answer your own question, then, when you talk about the people of Bihar in India, where they're using 1% as much electricity as Americans, and you're saying to them, right, we want you to use more expensive energy, i.e. renewables, clean energy, rather than coal, how do you make that case to them?
And I think the path is going to run through, look, if you keep on this coal path, heavy reliance on coal, what's going to come bundled with that is climate change down the road, but today what's going to come is very high levels of air pollution and shortened lives, and sicker lives for that matter.
So Paul, and then Ted, you want to come on this?
Yeah, well, just a couple of quick things. One is that it's important to say that the Paris Agreement is also the first international agreement to put all countries on a level playing field. Not that every country is expected to do the same thing, but the US and China are not in separate categories, which these two countries have been in the whole history of this climate regime, dating from the very first days. And so I think if anything, these targets that China and India and others have set, the risk is not that they're weak. The risk is that they will spur so much innovation and market growth in these countries that we will get left behind if we don't strengthen our targets over time. You know, one of China's targets by 2030 in terms of the pace of clean energy build out, they have to build a gigawatt, which is a lot, of clean energy every week. Between now and 2030, which is like a nuclear power station worth of clean energy every week. It's a huge amount. It's a hugely ambitious target. And you know, they have said that they will peak their emissions around 2030, if not before. I mean, that sounds like a long time from now, but it is, believe me, like turning a supertanker around. And you cannot turn a supertanker around on a dime. So they're in the wheelhouse spinning the wheel is what they're doing right now. And let's all root for them, but also make sure that we domestically are not being left behind and that this is a kind of race to the top. And on that front, I just want to say it's important not to overstate this expensive energy issue. The cost of clean energy is going down dramatically quickly in a lot of areas, particularly solar and wind. And it has achieved cost parity in many states with dirtier forms of energy. So the key for these countries, these poorer countries, is not to make them swallow more expensive energy. It's to accelerate the rate at which we and others are making technological advancements that reduce that cost. So it's not a matter of saying, well, I'm sorry, but for the sake of the planet, you're going to have to choose this rather than that form of energy.
Thank you. Ted, you want to come in?
I feel a little like Benjamin Carson. Well, I get to talk now?
I'm sorry. I was waiting. You were my secret weapon. I was waiting to deploy.
I'm the only.
Can you heal with those hands?
I'm the only person here that is not deeply embedded in policy. I run an independent investment bank based here in Chicago that I think by any measure is the largest renewable bank in this country, and we do business in Latin America, Canada, and are involved today in a capital raise that for a developer that is doing a development in Africa and the Middle East and India. And I would just say that for everybody's perspective, I think it's important, Michael touched on this, is that you really have two sort of different worlds. The developed world has sort of occurred around capital formation because generally the utilities in the countries were forced to buy renewable energy. In Europe, they used something called a feed-in tariff. In the United States, we used an RFP system. But effectively, what became available the last 15, 18 years was, but what the constraint is capital. Almost always, the governments are below investment grade. Typically, the utilities are controlled by the government. The utilities are almost all, what we in this country would call junk bond, triple C, double C type of things. You can't finance against those in the normal private markets. There are some states in India, I think that's 4 out of 32, that are investment grade. The country is actually low investment grade. But in Africa, Nigeria, for example, forget about it. And so I just would say that as we're talking about these countries keeping their commitments, to me, the constraint is really, if you think about the objective, it's in this country, it's to generally take down coal, and what you're seeing is natural gas and renewables that are filling that void. In countries like Nigeria, there's, I think, 10 gigawatts of capacity for 190 million people. It's, you know, I mean, we have 1,000 gigawatts in the United States for 315. So, you know, to use your, you know, use your math, it's incredible, the growth rates. GDP is growing 1-2% in Mexico. The demand for electricity is growing by 10%. So all the growth in the world is going to be there, but the constraint will be capital. And the challenge that I would just, you know, have, you know, this group, you know, sort of consider is how private capital comes together with public capital and you know, the multilaterals, the World Banks of the world, in order to make that happen. And you start talking about, you know, I appreciate Paul saying, you know, we got to up our game and go even further, but at least the numbers that Bloomberg New Energy put out call for just well above $1 billion, or well above $1 trillion of capital that is going, private capital that is going to have to come into this space to effectively switch the you know, carbon emitting baseload power over you know, more and more towards renewables. So.
And that, as you were saying when we were talking before we just came on here, you know, talk about all these policy objectives, these goals, these international agreements. You're the guy that's actually got to make it happen, right? Or you and people like you, because as you say, realistically, governments are not going to pay for this stuff. It has to be private
investors
capital.
buy internal rates of return, long-term internal rates of return, and they'll live with friction, they'll live with taxes, they'll live with currency controls, all of those things. But you know, the more you move away from certainty, and the more you move towards a risky spectrum, the higher the price will be, the more inefficient all the financing markets will be. You know, probably no surprise to anybody in this room.
So we had the UN Secretary General talking about this last week in New York, and he was saying that in order to kind of get on the track for meeting the Paris objectives, investment in clean energy has got to be a lot higher than it is at the moment. As you say, you know, talk about Bloomberg, people talking about these significantly higher numbers. The Secretary General had that figure. I think he said the world needed to double its investment in clean energy within the next 5 years by 2020, and that's from about I think 330 billion or so it was last year, then up to 660. Is that realistic? Can the world scale up clean energy investment that quickly?
You know, I'll sort of defer. I'll just give you my answer. I actually believe if the environment and the returns are there, the shortage is always good deals, not capital. As long as the United States and the central banks of the world are running virtually zero real interest rates, I think there will be capital to go into places where there's a return. I think the open question will be the risk reward. You know, what's growing the wind and the solar business in the United States has been that investors have gotten a real return after inflation, after taxes. And the open question is, as people go around the world, whether that'll be the same thing.
Sorry, Michael, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I'll just turn to the point I started with. For this, none of this really happens unless there's a fair playing field for renewables and low carbon energy sources. And so my response to Ted is investors will get all those things as soon as countries outside the United States, and the United States markets are not perfect, but as soon as countries outside the United States effectively have a price on carbon, that is, they tax the damages that using fossil fuels cause. And I think that, my view is that that's the root problem, and until that happens, it's going to be challenging to bring all the capital in that's necessary. Not impossible. There's other policy tools, but and I'll pick a little bit of a fight here, just since we're probably shouldn't disagree with each other all the time. With Paul, I think the reason these policy interventions are necessary is because if you ignore the climate damages associated with using fossil fuels, then the fossil fuels are cheaper to a first approximation.
It is true that they're cheaper if there's an embedded base of capital that's already been spent. Yeah. That it's cheaper to run coal through a coal plant than it is to build a whole new system. But when you're dealing with Nigeria as an example, and you're greenfielding, it's amazing how close solar is becoming to coal and gas.
Yeah, it's not to deny the tremendous improvements, but and again, now I'm going to pick a fight with Ted as well. Some of the statistics are a little
Ben Carson.
misleading. And the reason they're a little misleading is the numbers that people cite are what it would cost to add a couple, some electricity into the system, like on a very sunny day or on a windy day. And what that misses, this is not the case in Nigeria, I'm sure, it's certainly not the case in India that there's 24/7 electricity. But if you have a system that requires 24/7 electricity, which is what a lot of developed countries have, those injections impose costs on the system because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And you have to have some backup for those moments when that's not happening. And that backup is an added cost that gets introduced into the system.
Paul, you've been disagreed with, and also there were a couple of other things I think you wanted to say about the...
I think there are three things that need to happen for this, and we already touched on two of them. One is we need good policies that incentivize this kind of investment in these countries, in every country, because you cannot shove private capital into countries where it's not incentivized to go. And using public money to try to do that is a waste of public money. You do need to have deeper capital markets in these countries, so it's not just U.S., we're not just trying to torque U.S. capital to go into every country in the world to solve this problem. There are pools of savings in these countries that can be tapped, but it's a matter of figuring out how to get them through the banking system so that they're applied. But the third piece, which Michael's comment speaks to, is we have to innovate faster on the R&D side for technologies. You might have heard of the Tesla Powerwall or whatever it's called. It's the first of probably something which will become commonplace in 10 years' time, which is a storage system for electricity storage, an efficient, high-powered storage system, so that if you do have solar on your roof and it's generating more power than you need at that moment, you're able to store it and then keep your lights on it at night. The rate at which we are innovating in areas like that, like carbon capture and storage, like other technologies that are really breakthrough energy technologies, is really, really important. And the United States does about a third of all of the R&D for clean energy around the world. And one of the things we did in Paris is that we led a group of 20 of the biggest R&D players in the world, countries, to commit to double our R&D over the next 5 years. And we partnered with Bill Gates, who brought 28 billionaires together to commit to funding the risky early stage part of the technology development chain, so that you create like a conveyor belt of more innovation, risky early stage financing, and then we can do the larger scale rollout later.
Which is something that in some people's opinion was actually the most important thing of all that happened in Paris. Now, different views on that, but I've certainly heard that said. Sorry, Derek, you wanted to...
Well, I think where this is all leading to is that there needs to be a path to prosperity for countries around the world that leads to and through clean energy and not fossil fuel energy. And that does require the basket of interventions that we're talking about today. It also requires an awareness in places like India, as there was in China over the last decade, that the deleterious impacts of air pollution and water pollution and the other issues that arise with unlimited, unpriced pollution are a material detriment to growth and prosperity in your country. And creating citizen demand and public and ultimately political demand for change is going to be an increasingly important component here. And in places like India, where there are 200 million people who lack electricity, the path needs to go directly from none to clean. It's not really an option. With Ted talking about Nigeria, I would argue the same imperative exists. And so I believe there's a lot of money, a lot of private and public money on the sidelines waiting for the right incentives and the right markets to emerge to see investments pointing more clearly towards clean energy.
We've had a bit of talk about Iowa. The state has been mentioned this evening. Interested in thoughts, whoever wants to comment on this, on the US political landscape, on what there is perhaps from President Obama in terms of the time he has left to him, what can be done in terms of setting a direction for policy that might last, and also how things might evolve and change if we have a different administration, if we have a Republican president in a year's time.
I'll give a quick shout
yeah,
out.
go on then.
I'll give a quick shout out to Paul and the Obama administration. We had on the 19th of December an incredible extension of the production tax credits and the investment tax credit that effectively gave the solar and the wind industry of the United States some runway and some certainty after years of very short-term extensions. And I actually think it's going to do the job. I would probably, take.
Sorry, just to say you would do the job, meaning what?
I think you're going to see massive growth in the United States as coal. I mean, the story in the United States is all about cheap gas. Cheap gas is essentially cannibalizing coal. As coal's coming down, the two winners are renewables and gas. I think you're going to see massive amounts of stuff. I could maybe take a little commentary on the production tax credit and the ill-wisdom of using a 1990 tax incentive, but we'll take it.
It does the job.
Right.
Sorry, Derek, do you want to talk about that?
Well, sure. I mean, I wish I could sit on this panel forever so I didn't get any emails about the caucus results tonight. But given that that's an inevitability, I do think that outside of the presidential campaign, there are some shifts that we're beginning to see in the political landscape in the U.S. And some of those shifts are that people are beginning, the general public are beginning to think more pragmatically about this issue. There are certainly more examples of extreme weather that make people understand more viscerally what the problem we face now and what the problem we'll continually face in the future is. We've seen members of both parties on the Hill begin to take votes, such as the votes that protected those tax credits, also failed attempts on Capitol Hill to derail President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which are important signals that increasingly there is not a politically safe space to be if you're completely anti-climate. And so as we look towards the next months of the Obama administration and into the transition, Congress has to act. Congress has a mandate to support the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in this country so that we get to where we need to get by mid-century. Congress is the only part of the world that's actively considering or being exposed to this issue where zero action is being taken. And it's not just about the president's leadership, it's about the Supreme Court's decision in 2007 about the endangerment of greenhouse gases. So I actually think that once the spectacle of the primaries is in the rearview mirror, we will have some opportunities to move the political needle further and faster in the U.S.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to talk?
Yeah, I think when we look to the future and the next 4 years or 8 years, there's good news. The good news is that a clean energy future is not a scary place. And we now have quite a lot of data about the fact that we've had 70 consecutive months of job creation in the United States, and our emissions are going down. They're going down quite substantially. The line goes like this, like most lines do, but we are succeeding in decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions, which we understand has all of these negative impacts. We should feel confident as a nation that this is a good path to be on, and I think that I hope that's what's going to be carried forward into this next administration, is a sense of confidence that this can be done, that it is a good thing, and that we as a country of innovators, as a country that's more nimble in so many ways, even though we're a big country than other countries around the world, want to do this, and we want to lead in this instead of treating it as a kind of some sort of apocalyptic vision of a clean energy future. I think that's a very hard thing to put together in your head.
And in terms of Paris, in terms of kind of what comes next, are there kind of immediate milestones and things we should be looking for? How does it advance kind of for the rest of the year, let's say?
So on the Paris side itself, what happened in Paris and I was in the room, and it was an incredible moment when the agreement was put forward for adoption. Everyone jumped out of their seats and just started screaming. It was a very kind of cathartic moment for 190 90-plus countries that were there. But the gavel just meant that we agreed on the text. So now countries need to bind themselves to this agreement, they need to sign it, and they need to go through whatever domestic processes they need to go through in order to ratify it or join it in a formal way. The agreement will enter into force only when 55 countries representing at least 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions have joined it. And so, you know, it's a numbers race from here on. We, of course, hope that that will happen relatively soon. We're going to do our part to make sure we're part of it.
And to be clear about the US does not need to ratify it because it's not a treaty, right? So it doesn't go to the Senate. What happens here?
It does not go to the Senate for advice and consent because it does not have legally binding targets or legally binding financial commitments. It has other parts that are legally binding. But in our system, it does not go to the Senate for advice and consent, given its form.
So how does the US formally sign on? The president signs it, or what?
Well, it's a process of the way that you do these things in international law, and the State Department will go through X steps and present it to the president. It's a formal process, but it's not a complicated one.
Okay, so I'm going to open to questions from the floor in just a moment. So if people want to be thinking about things they might want to ask. But just before we do, I have one question I wanted to give to everyone on the panel first, which is, in terms of your kind of priorities for what comes next, for the next steps after Paris, for kind of beginning to turn the Paris Agreement into a reality and to actually make it something useful and constructive in terms of addressing the threat of climate change, what would you do? And I don't know who wants to start, but why don't we, if we start maybe Derek with you and then come down the line, what's your, if you were to pick one priority and say, okay, this is what we really need to get done, what would it be?
Well, the door is open now for countries and states around the world to collaborate to develop markets for pricing and trading emissions that is proven to be the fastest way to cut pollution and transition to a low-carbon economy. Those guidelines are in the text of the Paris Agreement, and the framework is there, and now countries as diverse as Mexico, Korea, Canada, states like California, those jurisdictions can work even more directly and in earnest to build markets that ratchet down climate change emissions as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, so that was my answer.
That's why I went first.
So let me just add to it, though. I think that should be complemented by, and very encouragingly, as part of the Paris Agreement, this was built into it. I think it's Mission Innovation, is that the name? Is that there should really be a collective global effort to continue to build on the remarkable decline in the cost of clean energy. And the U.S. government, I know, I think it'll be in the president's budget to double spending, just as was promised, on basic R&D, which is a fundamental role that government should play. And I think that is critical to happen. And of almost equal importance that it happen around the rest of the world as well.
Thank you. Ted?
I actually think that as countries sort of decide, we really want foreign direct investment, which is sort of part and parcel of we want, maybe they don't want foreign direct investment, but to make the trillions of dollars or billions of dollars done, they have to bring in outside capital generally. They really have to look at their infrastructure. There's still a lot of countries that once you put a dollar in, you can't get the dollar back out. There's still huge amounts of countries that have prohibitive tax structures where they really work exactly opposite of what the governments are trying to accomplish. And so I do think that you have to, and there's still places in the world where you land a wind turbine and the harbor master shakes you down for a month and a half. So it's a non-trivial thing to put in the infrastructure so that capital in the form of equipment and in the form of real money comes in, and multilaterals can help, but it's non-trivial. There's still, of those 190 countries, I'd liken 100 of them as still being problematic in terms of doing business there.
Which really does point, I guess, to one of the reasons why climate change is a very tough and intractable problem to solve. Even if you can get the governments to agree, still you're talking about a very profound program of economic reform, economic, legal, regulatory reform.
Well, that's right, and dealing with corruption and et cetera. So.
Which are things that probably a lot of people have been trying to tackle for a very long time anyway, even without the additional incentive of climate change as a motive for wanting to do that. I guess perhaps if you were going to be positive, you could say maybe that would provide an additional stimulus, and that would be something that might encourage countries to put in place the reforms that are needed. But
Look, I'm a long-term optimist.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen tomorrow.
Cool. Well, two answers to that real quick. The sort of general answer, I would agree with everything that's been said and the importance of carbon pricing as a solution. I think if I were to think about it overall and figure out a metric for judging how we're doing, it's pace. How fast is this happening? How fast are emissions? Is that emissions curve being bent down? It's still going up globally. So it's not about going like this, but how fast are we making the changes we need to make? Because that's actually a really important factor. The amount that we cumulatively emit, both from a carbon point of view and from an associated air pollution point of view, a lot of lives and livelihoods depend on the answer to that. So for me, it all kind of boils down to pace. But on a personal level, I think my answer to that is that I think that it's easy to say after Paris or after, listening to good news about clean energy costs going down to think, oh, great, they have solved that problem. Governments have solved that problem, and technology is great, and people are driving electric cars, and it's not my problem. But in fact, I think the real change has to include, among other things, thinking about it differently in your own life. And so I'm answering it on a personal level, which is not just thinking of it as a problem that's outsourced to somebody else, governments and companies, but thinking about how the decisions you make in your everyday life, and I'm not talking about sacrifices, I'm talking about things that can save you money, like you being more energy efficient in the way that you use energy. Just thinking about it and embedding it into the realities of everyday life. That would be a beautiful thing.
thank you very much indeed.
All right,
Well, if anyone has any thoughts on that or the other issues we've been talking about, that'd be fantastic. John, I'll be throwing it over to
absolutely.
you for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So please raise your hand if you have a question. We have microphones out in the audience, and we have a wealth of expertise, obviously, in our 5 panelists. So if you have it directed at someone, please let us know who it is. Otherwise, be first come, first serve on it. All right, let's come right up here in the center, and then we'll come over here.
Is there any international discussion other than this emissions about some of the other factors, such as the methane from the ruminants and the cattle and increased consumption of animal products as one of the dangers that we should be dealing with?
Derek might want to.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. There's a whole suite of activities that need to be undertaken in order to do what we need to do to cut tens of billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of this century. And the issue that you mentioned in the agriculture sector is an important one as well. Methane, I'm very glad that you brought up methane, because 25% of all the global warming that we're experiencing right now comes from methane, because it's so powerful in the first 20 years after it's emitted. And so in addition to the issue you're describing, there's also a great opportunity which the president has been a leader on, which is controlling methane from oil and gas operations in the United States. And there's increased momentum around doing that, not just in the US, but also in Mexico and Canada, with new information about how cheaply that can be done. So there's different interventions and solutions depending on where you are in the world and what is really going to be able to be done cost effectively. But in no way is this discussion meant to suggest that there's any silver bullet answer.
I mean, as I understand it, obviously we've been talking a lot about energy and about shifting from fossil fuels to clean energy here while we've been talking. As I understand it, one of the reasons why a lot of the discussion does focus on energy is because that is a relatively easy one to fix. We can sort of see a pathway towards reducing energy emissions by shifting to renewables and nuclear power. Agriculture is a tougher one to crack. I think that's, would I be right in saying that? Paul, is that fair?
Yeah, so imagine you're New Zealand, okay, and you're the only developed country where emissions from cows are greater than emissions from people. But cows are still part of the human, economic system. Their emissions are kind of because we drink their milk and we eat their meat and so on. So it is a head scratcher if you have to meet targets that involve reducing emissions from cows as opposed to reducing emissions from people. But believe it or not, there's all sorts of dietary supplements that are developed to make cows' digestion work better and reduce emissions. So it's a very interesting and diverse problem across many areas. So agriculture and chemicals and so on.
And there is actually, someone's actually designed an apparatus that can fit onto a cow, right, to trap the meat.
I've not heard that.
If you Google it, you will find it. It doesn't look terribly practical to me, but people have thought about it.
I haven't heard about that.
Take
Sure.
another minute.
Let's go over here. I saw a hand here about the fourth row.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to say thanks for your insight on clean energy. I work for clean energy, so it seems like I'll be employed for a long time. But my one concern is, where do you see nuclear energy fitting in? It's only been mentioned once, and that was in a comparative statement. So I'd like to see, do you consider that clean energy? It's extremely efficient fuel, and it is, you can power a lot with it. So I'd like to hear your insights on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge with nuclear is this uneven playing field that I talked about. So nuclear has, like coal and natural gas plants, can offer baseload energy. That means you can have it basically continuously. It doesn't have this problem of only when the sun shines or the wind blows. And nuclear is effectively handicapped right now because emitting carbon through the use of fossil fuels is essentially free. And I think if we really had a level playing field, I suspect there would be a much bigger role for nuclear in the future. Now, in the very short term, there is, everything is kind of being bullied around by the low natural gas prices, but I think over a longer horizon, with a levelized playing field, you would see nuclear play a larger role. And it's hard to imagine a future without nuclear playing a bigger role.
I was going to say, sorry, I'm just interested, is nuclear financeable at the moment? Can you get people to invest in nuclear?
It's tough. It is financeable because the United States has been, I think the plant that's being built in South Carolina by Southern is being financed, but it's very, very tricky. It can only be done with government guarantees. And maybe you've put your finger on it that it's but the reality has been that we don't have a solution for the waste, and so I certainly am seeing with cheap gas in the United States pressure to not turn off nukes. I think 3 have turned off in the last couple of years, and certainly are not seeing a lot of initiatives to grow. I think certainly in the United States, I think it's small. I think the only place that's growing in the world is China.
I think there are some advanced nuclear technologies that
Yes,
we're
some
just
smaller,
learning about,
right.
and I think this is an area where substantial government funding and research into that would probably be wise.
Well, what's the EDF's position? Traditionally, the environmental movement has not been very pro-nuclear, but there, you do hear some environmentalists say that because of climate change being the greater threat, they would now support investment in nuclear power. What's your position?
Well, I think Michael and Ted both captured different challenges associated with the issue around costs and around waste disposal. And there's no question that in order to get to basically a carbon neutral world in the second half of this century, we can't be just dismissing any technology that can deliver carbon-free electricity. But as Michael was alluding to with the full social costs of everything we use to produce energy, we have to really be thinking holistically. So any technology that can meet those tests and can succeed in hopefully an increasingly priced world where pollution costs money, and where you have to factor in the very real impacts on people and ecosystems and communities, we shouldn't discriminate. We have to create a level playing field. But I acknowledge the challenges that these gentlemen have just mentioned.
Do you want, the administration is pro-nuclear, right?
Recognizing the challenges, a very large percentage of the clean electrons that are produced in the United States and many other countries come from nuclear power, and we are continuing to work on breakthrough energy technologies, but but we have one that is a large-scale baseload clean energy technology, and for circumstances where that's required, that you're not going to build a nuclear power plant of the current variety on a small island. You're not going to necessarily build one in Tanzania or a country where the name of the game is to get a lot of people who are widely distributed access to electricity. You can do that through other means. But there's no question that it has a role to play, and we'll continue to have a role to play in the decades to come.
Speaking as someone who comes from a small island, I can tell you that it is quite difficult to build nuclear power in my
Yes,
country,
that's right.
certainly. Yes.
I saw a question here in the second row. There's a microphone coming.
Hi. The debate seems to be structured around fossil fuels versus renewables. And those are the two alternatives. But it seems to me that coal and oil or petroleum products are quite different in terms of their polluting effects than natural gas. And there's a tremendous amount of natural gas both being discovered, like in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and also being turned into transportable ocean-going ships that can deliver it. So why wouldn't that be, or is that, maybe is the better question, is that sort of an interim solution until we can get the other technologies into a position where they're more affordable?
Paul, do you want to talk about this?
Yes, gas absolutely is an important, it's often called a bridge fuel, from, bridging from a world of comparatively dirtier fuels to one of clean. But it does have an interesting problem, which Derek alluded to. How many folks here have used natural gas to heat their homes? Put up your hands. Everybody, right. So, that a little bit. Natural gas is made up mostly of methane. And it turns out that from the point where you extract the gas and transport it often a very long distance to where you use it, there are a million places where it can leak out. And if only a small percentage of that gas leaks out on the way, the carbon footprint is worse than coal. So that's why it's really important to focus, as Derek said, on oil and gas and on methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. That's what that means, because methane is natural gas. In large part. So it's an interesting challenge for the natural gas industry, and we're just now starting to understand how the potential for those leaks all across the system, and we've really got to tighten down on them if we want to use natural gas as a bridge fuel from a climate point of view.
And the dilemma that Paul is describing is a big reason why Environmental Defense Fund has been, for 5 years now, partnering with major academic institutions and companies in the oil and gas sector to improve the data that we have to really ascertain what the point at which natural gas becomes a net negative on the climate. I mean, ultimately, we're going to have a fossil-free future, but the role of natural gas in that future is still up for debate largely because of data and uncertainties around the data.
I would just say that at least in the short run, though, if they fix the leaks, and assuming then that's certainly what the natural gas industry is committed themselves to do, at $2.25 natural gas and 6,200 heat rate machines, natural gas has got a very bright future for the next number of years.
Okay, we're going to come up here to the front row. And I know we've got a group of lab school students. I'm going to look back at you next, so hopefully one of you have a question.
So there's a number of groups that have talked about if you burn more than 20% of the existing reserves, and that also means that, no new reserves. Don't create any more new reserves, which you create them, the idea would be to burn them. So when I hear all this, and I hear talk about, natural gas as a bridge, it seems inconsistent if it's reasonably accurate, and whether it's 20% or 30% or 40%, but is it relatively accurate that if you burn more than 20% of the existing reserves that you cannot contain the climate at 2%, at 2 degrees centigrade?
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I think what you've raised is a critical point, which is that the world is basically awash in fossil fuels. And more awash than it was even 5 or 10 years ago, largely due to the innovation. So there's been a lot of innovation in clean energy, but what probably shouldn't be lost is that there's been a lot of innovation in fossil fuels as well. And there's too many fossil fuels laying in the ground that are accessible relatively inexpensively to stay below most climate targets that people have in mind. And I think that, there's an element of being a broken record here, but all of that reflects the uneven playing field. And if fossil fuels really, had to compete on a level playing field and had to pay for the damages they cause, and if we invested in the clean energy R&D that it's a natural role for governments, we would have a very different picture. But you are correct. If we use all the fossil fuels in the ground, there will be unimaginable changes in the planet.
Yeah, Paul?
So how could we be talking about natural gas as a bridge?
Well, natural gas is a far lower carbon profile than oil and coal. So if you're just ranking, and oil's not, oil's really used for transportation.
Yeah, we don't make electricity with oil.
But there's an interesting debate which has just started, and trying to again tie it back to your own life. If you have holdings in the stock market, mutual funds, or if your pension does, the way that chances are that you hold stock if you have a diversified portfolio in an oil or coal or gas company. The way that the value of those companies is calculated on the stock market, their market capitalization, is a function of the value of the proved reserves that they have. And so there's now an analysis trying to add up. Well, if you add up all the proved reserves that these companies have, and you burn them all, because that's what they're saying. They're saying, I'm worth X because I have all these reserves, so eventually I'm going to pull them out of the ground and burn them. Turns out that's not necessarily compatible with the climate goals we've set. So either we don't meet the climate goals, or those aren't going to get pulled out of the ground and burned. And if it's the latter, then what's the valuation of these companies actually based on? And that affects everyone here who potentially. So it's not a question that has an answer yet, but the question's just now being posed, and it's one that, again, implicates our savings and implicates the choices that we're making.
And to your point, there's a raw substitution for bringing down coal and bringing in cleaner gas, but it's still not perfect. It's still, 50, 60% of what the CO2 that a modern coal plant puts out.
I was going to say, because when people talk about that 20%, a lot of that is actually coal, right? If you look at the kind of the carbon content of all the world's fossil fuels, coal is the majority of that. I think I'm right in saying. So you could imagine if there were, some shifting.
Right. And to Paul's point, the coal companies, don't worry about them. If you haven't sold them, they're worthless. So I'm not sure if that's really a fair and true statement, but if you look at, I think the market cap of Peabody, which has a $7 billion book net worth, I think is $200 million.
It's amazing.
Let me just touch upon that, which is something that the Obama administration has recently taken a whack at. If we had, and coming back to this idea with a theme which is on this panel of leveling the playing field, the Obama administration has kind of put a moratorium on coal leases. And so let me put a fine point on why that might make sense, or at least why it's in the neighborhood of the right thing to do, is the market value of the coal that's taken out of the ground in the Powder River Basin in Wyoming is about 1/6 the climate damages that will ensue from using that coal. And that's if you use the U.S. government's estimate of the social cost of carbon. And so it's a fundamentally nonsensible thing to do if you had a levelized playing field, and we have to continue to work toward that.
Okay, so there's a question here in the front row. I want to check with the lab school students first. Yeah, we'll go back there, then we'll come back up here.
According to the World Wildlife Fund, at a minimum, 27 species go extinct every day. Should there be more of a sense of urgency to reduce irreversible damage to the climate? How can the public help promote faster action by politicians and professionals? And to what extent can the world be rehabilitated after damage has occurred?
Interesting. 3 questions. So,
Well, Thanks for
Yeah,
the
go on.
question. You've really hinted at the real holistic damages that climate change can affect upon the world. And sadly, one of the more pressing issues that has started to come up, especially at the international meetings, is this issue of how do you adapt to climate change. Because as we are aggressively talking about how to cut pollution, we also have to have a clear-eyed sense that a lot of what's already happening and has already happened is probably irreversible. And so to the extent that we can put an architecture in place that helps countries manage habitats for critical species, that helps protect coastlines, and to put up the same sort of infrastructure to protect against climate change impacts as we're trying to do to cut climate change pollution, that's going to be very critical. I think that the question, the idea that that there might be some reversal of species loss is certainly, you know, that's rolling the dice. I think that we have to take this problem incredibly seriously and realize that the background level of extinctions has increased dramatically, exponentially in the last decades, and that the urgency that we bring to this issue cannot be overstated.
And then maybe to pick up on the first part of the question as well, why not go faster, right? Given the urgency of the problem, given, despite everything that's been said about the great achievement in Paris, you know, maybe it's still not enough. I mean,
I think there's, so first of all, the speaker, the questioner went to the labs, goes to lab school, is that right? Yeah, okay, so lab school, I'm a graduate. I think there's one problem that I think we have is a difficulty in translating what the scientists are trying to tell us about the changes in the planet and turning that into the kind of very cold, rational, analytic numbers that people like me like to deal with. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for taking what the scientists tell us will happen to the planet and converting that into kind of a monetary value of damages from an extra ton of CO2 emissions. And that's actually something that we're doing at the University of Chicago. And why I think that could be helpful is that could help to drive home the reality of what causing CO2 emissions will be, and in principle enact change based on that.
and also sometimes, presumably, calculating a monetary value is just impossible. I mean, what is the value of a species that becomes extinct is what, in financial terms?
Yeah, no, that's complicated.
Right. Yeah. Why not go faster, Paul? Jim?
Well, I think it's clear from this panel that if you want to go faster, you should elect economists.
That's not a good thing to run on, though. We can be sure of that.
No, we need to go faster. I think we have in the last few years accelerated the pace from, you know, very slow to middling, and hopefully things reach a tipping point when technologies start to work together, like solar and storage, when the price of those technologies goes down. But again, like I said, the complacency is not an option, even though we've got some big headline about an agreement in Paris.
And the other part of that question about what can the public do in terms of kind of bringing pressure on politicians, what's your, you know, what can the public most usefully do? Yeah.
Well, communicating with your elected leaders, both before they're elected and after they've been elected, to make sure that the imperative that we all feel for this issue is translated to elected officials. You always hear that 75% of Americans support the Clean Power Plan, or 65% of Americans believe that we need to do something about climate change. And that's true, but we need to be talking to our friends and our neighbors and our communities about making sure that that imperative that we feel internally gets translated externally, whether it's when you're going to a meeting at the Iowa caucuses, when you're voting, or when you're going up to the Hill to see your member of Congress.
Okay, great. I saw a hand up here in the front row. Was that still a question? Yeah. Oh, there he comes.
Well, you began to answer it with your 65%, but it's my perception that we're experiencing the first generation of voters who really truly believe, understand, and are frightened by climate change. And that can have, obviously, the effect of rapidly accelerating the attacking of climate change, because I believe that these are people who are willing to pay the penalty that Michael's talking about we need to pay for. Is that true here in the United States, and is this also a global situation, and can it really accelerate our addressing of climate change?
Well, can I say something about that? I think it's important when you go around and talk to people from a lot of other countries and engage in the diplomacy of climate action. We're really one of very few countries in the world where there isn't a broad-based political consensus across the political spectrum that this is an issue we need to deal with. So I think here it's still part of the political debate. Is it real? Is it not real? Should we do something about it? Should we not do something about it? That debate is over in most of the world. And part of the reason that it's over in the developing countries, by the way, is that we are insulated, more insulated from the effects of climate change overall than people who live in countries where agriculture, where a majority of the population is in agriculture. If you work the land every day, you see how you depend on the climate, on a stable climate for your livelihood, your family's livelihood. In this country, we have a fairly small percentage of the population who's directly engaged in agriculture. And we have the resources.
Yeah, but a lot of them live in this state.
Yeah.
and we're also a coal state.
And we have the resources to adapt to climate change if we must. A lot of countries don't have those resources. So, I think it's important to travel, frankly, to answer the earlier question from the lab school student. Travel the world and see how people live. And you'll understand that not everyone has the privileges we do, but that translates into a different way of thinking about this problem.
Half my company is below 30, and I would say...
you yourself,
but I would say it's unquestionably that we're hiring against Wall Street and other people because people really do see us as one young guy said, if I work for you guys, I can do good and do well. So there's no question that you're seeing the generation diving in deep.
But I agree, there's a major challenge, though, and that is that elected officials tend to readily dismiss the power of the younger electorate to turn out to vote and make their voices heard and therefore have their priorities felt at the voting booth. And that is something that also is starting to change, and I'm looking at Wendy because she's been a leader in mobilizing college students through her program, No Tomorrow. And there's also a lot of other efforts around the world really focused on the increase in the percentage of the population that is young, even under 18 in some parts of the world, means that you're right. These are the generations that are going to pay for it, but also just naturally we're seeing a more open-minded and more disposed towards action generation emerging. So maybe under 25s in the US could be kind of like the whole rest of the world, which is the debate's over. It's just that we need to demonstrate that those millennials have the political influence to push politicians to be in the right place.
Okay, we're going to slip in one more really, really quick one. We can go right here in the front. Actually, we're going to take two. Ask your question, then Wendy, I think you had a question as well.
Is it possible to get to a clean energy future just through R&D and those kinds of things that lower the cost of renewables? Or is it going to require pricing carbon in some way to level the playing field?
Let's get that one. Let's get Wendy's as well and answer them all kind of at once.
Mine was really just a follow-up to your question, too. You mentioned the word penalty for a price on carbon, and I think what we're not talking about is a revenue stream, so that, yes, there's a price on carbon, but that also gives us a tremendous opportunity, because while you're paying for this price on carbon, you've got the $1 trillion, whatever you need, to create the renewable energy infrastructure, so that there's your revenue source to do it. So I feel like there's not enough conversation about the opportunity from a price on carbon and not just being a tax and a penalty. So
great. Well, we're going to test our panel's short-term memory. We're going to do one other one, batch them all together, and then we're going to do quick answers right behind you. Here. And then we're going to close.
Thank you very much. I'll make it really quick. At what point does the scientific community feel we will cross a threshold that will effectively force us from soft tightening to compulsion? And we can all agree that our soft power has always been our leading strength, but Are we undermining our global efforts in the international community by setting such an example of disparity in per capita income? 14,000 versus 140.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, well, so two. First one about carbon pricing then, and possibly what can be done with the proceeds of carbon pricing, and is it necessary? Who wants to?
Well, we need a price on carbon, and Michael will tell you why.
Again, no, I think it would be great if R&D was enough, but it has the flavor of hope as a strategy. And I think that's very rarely a successful strategy.
Sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
But the U.S. has largely succeeded in building an industry with state renewable portfolio standards, where each state effectively, as part of the PUC bargain, says, Mr. Utility, you're a monopoly. You have to step up and buy 20%, or in California it's 50% in electricity. That has been incredibly effective. And the PTC, ITC, I would argue the ITC has been incredibly effective in solar. The PTC has gotten some stuff done, but I would say it's a two-edged sword.
I just to pick up on Wendy's point about the revenue. Yes. So the point she's making, which is a good one, is if you had a carbon tax or a carbon cap and trade, in principle that would produce all kinds of revenues, and those there's a variety of mechanisms that could be used. They could be refunded to people directly. They could be used to reduce taxes on other things like income. And so it doesn't have to be viewed as like a increase in the size of government. One could hold government constant and just return the revenues. And that is a very appealing feature of carbon tax.
And politically, when you look at how it might work, making it revenue neutral, in other words, any increase in the tax on carbon is matched by cuts in taxes on income, that probably looks like the one's most likely to win.
Yeah, that deal is out there to be had. I'm sure there's one party that
came close,
ready, willing, and able if another party would meet them.
Right. Cool.
So maybe to address the gentleman's question, and not to sort of end on a somber note, but at what point do we move to compel? The fact is we don't have many tools in international relations to compel countries to do things. And what I would say is that the agreement we've reached is part of a journey. It benefits from 21 years of trial and error on how you get countries to effectively cooperate on this issue. But, and we're all hopeful that because we all want to go to a clean energy future, because that's preferable, despite the localized cost to industries that have built up around coal and oil, that in the long term we all want to get there, and we just need confidence that we're all going to get there together, that the system we've created is going to get us there. Because if you look at the tools of compellence in the international system, we are far from applying them to an issue like climate change.
I meant more like at what point do we cross the line where we're in panic mode and we can no longer take it as a backseat concern, but the environment will get so bad that we're going to be forced to stop looking at it as an investment opportunity and start doing something about it.
Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people might say we're already there. There are a lot of people around the world who are experiencing worse and worse impacts. And the science is complicated because it's not a matter of like reaching a point and then, 2 degree, if you get to 2.001 degrees, it's all over. It doesn't work like that. But on the other hand, there's science to suggest that there might be tipping points that you reach when positive feedback loops start kicking in, and we don't know when that's going to happen. So in the interests of prudent management of our own planet, we need to prevent our ability to answer your question in real time.
And I would endorse Paul's statement earlier that the ultimate test of Paris really is how fast things happen, the pace of change. So that is going to be the legacy that this agreement and subsequent agreements are going to leave us with. And one thing I will point out is that Paul probably did, but none of us outsiders went to Paris and thought we'd end up with an agreement that included in the text, included the number 1.5 degrees, right? 1.5 degrees is clearly a signal in my mind that there's a sense among the world community that the damaging and catastrophic impacts of climate change are severe, and that we need to set the highest possible goal to train the eyes of the world on, so that in the future there is a new marker on which to base future policy. And that was, in my mind, a huge accomplishment in Paris.
Thank you. Paul, one final thought from you. I think we're...
I just thought you might explain what the 1.5 is.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for years it's been discussed among climate scientists and advocates that we need to try to stay underneath 2 degrees of warming, average warming on the planet, lower than historical levels. Many scientists and advocates and others have said, you know what, that's not even good enough. We need to go to 1.5 degrees. And that has not been seen as something that's really even on the table, because right now we're talking about, oh, well, a lot of people are saying, well, let's try to keep it to 3 or 4 degrees. So the idea that you would even float the idea of 1.5 degrees has, you might say, conventional wisdom might say that that should be maybe off limits because it's just kind of magical thinking. But the idea that that was in the text, that vision, to me that's a marker of ambition, and it's a sign that we're all in this together, that countries, the small island states that are already starting to disappear, are being, and the moral imperative around this issue is beginning to really come through in the international negotiations.
An excellent note to end on, but I think we do have to end it there,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and we actually ended a little bit optimistically, so thank you. That is all the time we have. Sorry we didn't get to your question, but we're going to continue these discussions, both EPIC and the council. So please stay in touch. We have materials in the back if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, and please follow everyone on Twitter. And please join me in thanking our panelists tonight.